Welcome to the Columbus Symphony Orchestra's Know the Score, hosted by Maestro George Del Gobbo. This week's edition will focus on our upcoming concert featuring works by Respighi, Berio, Barber, and Ives. We hope you enjoy this week's edition of Know the Score.
Hello, we're gathered here today to talk about the Columbus Symphony concert. This concert features a slightly reduced orchestra and the music of four composers. Two of them are Italian and two American. It's not a competition by any means, but they are all 20th century composers, and each one represents a particular attitude toward music in the 20th century. We start off with Ottorino Respighi, who was an Italian composer in the first half, basically, of the 20th century. He is known for his ability to orchestrate. In simple terms, that means to take his musical ideas and distribute them throughout the instruments of the orchestra in order to make the sounds that he wants, the best possible sounds, the best possible combinations of sounds. Most composers do this step in the composition process last. Most composers will write a piece out in the form of a piano score, or maybe a slightly expanded piano score of 3 or 4 staffs. And once the piece is worked out that way, then they will go back and assign parts to the orchestra. Some composers are very good at this. Rimsky-Korsakov comes to mind. Richard Strauss, certainly maybe the best ever. And Ottorino Respighi is certainly in the top 5 of composers who had an amazing ability to take a kind of an everyday theme and make it sound glorious by the way they employed the instruments of the orchestra. If you want to know who the bottom 5 are, I'll give you one name, Robert Schumann. As wonderful a composer as he was, and as amazing as his musical ideas were, he was not very adept at orchestration, and a lot of times his music, especially his symphonies, suffer because of that. Conductors and others will even rewrite parts of his music in order to try to get them to sound more comfortable and more like they belong in the piece. But anyway, that's a subject for another day. Respighi is well known for his orchestral music, and that music kind of divides itself into 2 groups. There is the group that deals with large instruments, numbers of instruments, big orchestras, like, for example, the Pines of Rome, the Fountains of Rome, Roman festivals, which are called the Roman Trilogy. These are all huge pieces. Roman festivals, for example, I believe employs something like 9 percussionists. I mean, it's a huge number of percussionists, way more than you would typically find in an orchestra. Church Windows is another piece that he wrote that uses a large orchestra. On the other hand, there is music for a much smaller orchestra. Pieces like the Ancient Airs and Dances, of which there are 3 sets. A piece called The Birds, and this piece we're going to play, which is the Botticelli Triptych. And these pieces tend to draw their inspiration in large part from old music, from Italian pieces from the 15th, 16th, 17th century. And he takes these old tunes and dresses them up and uses them as the basis for these pieces, which he does so well that they become much more enjoyable, and you get to hear them through different eyes, performed not the way they might have been performed when they were written, but through the eyes of a modern composer and one who has incredible skill at orchestrating. The Botticelli Triptych is based on 3 pictures that hang in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence by Sandro Botticelli, the famous Renaissance painter. And those pictures the first movement is based on the picture called Spring. The second is called The Adoration of the Magi. And the third is The Birth of Venus. That's the very famous picture of the woman standing in the very large clamshell. She's Venus, and she's apparently being born grown up, fully mature. He brings amazing color to these pieces by using particular instruments that are designed to be colorful. In any orchestra, the string section does, and the winds maybe don't want to hear this, but the string section does most of the work. They're almost always playing. They carry the melodies usually, provide the harmonies and the rhythm. And the woodwinds and the brass and the percussion, while they do contribute in those areas and with regularity, are most often used for the colors they provide. Each stringed instrument that sounds basically alike, you can make a line from the bass to the violin and see the continuity of sound as you go up through the registers. It's a little different with the woodwinds. Each woodwind instrument, flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, has a very, very distinct and different sound. And so while they are often used together, they can also be used as soloists and apart and in conjunction with other instruments in the orchestra to make certain colors. It's a lot like, I suppose, a painter with a palette of paints and combining various paints to get just exactly the hue that is required for any particular part of a picture. Likewise, the percussion instruments, there are thousands of percussion instruments, and they all have a particular dominant effect that they make. And some have more than one, but a triangle is a triangle. It's a metal triangle. You hit it with a beater and it makes a bell sound. You can make the bell sound last a long time. You can play it long or short. You can do all sorts of things, but it's going to be a bell sound. You can't really change it too much. The brass instruments are a little bit more like the stringed instruments. There is kind of a continuity from the lowest to the highest. And they are used in the orchestra a lot of times when power is needed, when heft is needed. And anytime there's a grand orchestral climax, you can be pretty sure that if there are brass instruments on the stage, they're taking part in that. But anyway, Respighi scores these pieces very, very lightly for strings and single winds, but he uses some color instruments. He uses the piano, which is a very flexible instrument. He uses the celesta, which is a small piano-like instrument, but it's basically like orchestra bells. When you press the key, a hammer strikes like if you see when in marching band, the bells that they play that are short little metal bars. That's what's inside a celesta. And the fact that it's connected to a keyboard makes it possible to play a lot more notes in a lot more facile way. And so the celesta is like a miniature piano, but making bell-like sounds. Then there's also the harp. And combining those three instruments, you can make a wonderful collection of sparkling sounds and the kind of sounds that Respighi felt he needed to express these pictures. I'm not sure what else to say about them. They are delightfully enjoyable, and as all of Respighi's music is, very accessible. He was not a contemporary, modern, avant-garde kind of composer. He very much employed traditional melodies and harmonies, and his orchestration is what makes his music. And his sense of drama and his sense of things are what make his music so enjoyable. The second piece on the program is by an American composer, and his name is Samuel Barber. He was perhaps the most popular American composer in the 20th century. He was born into a very musical family. His mother was a singer at the Metropolitan Opera, or maybe that was his aunt. His aunt was a singer at the Metropolitan Opera. His uncle was a composer. Both of his parents were musicians, and he was very precocious, and he knew from a very young age that he wanted to be a composer. His parents had other ideas, and they were very interested in having him grow up to be an all-American boy. And so they insisted that he play football and do other sports, and he hated every second of it. I would imagine that football back in the early part of the 20th century was a totally different game than it is today. Much more physical, perhaps, because there weren't helmets, there weren't face masks, there weren't anything. I mean, you just beat each other up. But Barber did not appreciate this very much. And when he was 9 years old, he wrote his mother a letter. And the letter said something to the effect of, "Dear Mother, I know that when I say this, you are going to cry, but I don't want to play football. I'm going to be a composer, and I hope that you and Father will recognize this fact and let me refrain from playing football in the future." So they did. He went on to the Curtis Institute when he was 14 years old. Curtis is a unique institution in music education in the United States. It was founded by Mary Louise Curtis and endowed to the point where people who go there don't have to pay tuition. And they accept, there's an age limit on the students that they accept. You can't be, I don't know what it is now, maybe more than 22. If you're older than 22, you can't get to go to Curtis, whereas you can go to Juilliard and other places. And they take very young students, and they have a program where young students from all over the world can go to Philadelphia, where Curtis is, and be in residence and actually go to school and go to Curtis at the same time and continue their musical training at a very, very high level at an age, early teens, when it does the most good. So Barber went to Curtis, was a student there. He learned composition, he learned conducting. He was also a very good baritone singer. Went on from there to have a wonderful career as a composer. He was not a risk-taking composer. He did not embrace the avant-garde trends of the first half of the 20th century. He was not interested in atonality or complex rhythms or forsaking everything in the past. His aesthetic lay much more in presenting music that had a strong lyrical sense and one that made an emotional connection rather than a purely intellectual connection to the audience. So this put him kind of out of the mainstream of musical thinking in the first half of the 20th century, but it put him right where the audiences wanted him to be, and they enjoyed his music immensely, and his music was always popular and always accepted by audiences, whereas the music of some of the more avant-garde people was avoided to this day by many people in the classical music audience. He wrote this piece, it's called Knoxville Summer of 1915, and he wrote it for soprano and orchestra. Most of Barber's music involved the voice in one way or another. He wrote many songs for voice and piano, and a lot of his larger ensemble pieces include the voice, and this is one of them. It's for soprano and orchestra, and it's a setting of a prose poem that James Agee wrote. And the poem is called Knoxville, Summer of 1915, and it's about the life of a boy in Knoxville at that time in the South, and it deals with his relationships with his parents and the way a boy was treated and what he did and the ambiance of the city and his searching for what it was all about, if you will. He includes a line in it saying, "It was a time where I lived disguised to myself as a child." And it's a very touching piece of writing. And Barber and Agee worked together to get it condensed to the point where it could be included in a piece that only lasted 15 or so minutes. And later on, when Agee wrote his novel, Death in the Family, he included this Knoxville piece as a prelude to that novel. And it's a remarkable piece of writing, extraordinarily touching and emotional. And Barber captures that in the music. It's astonishingly beautiful. It uses the soprano voice in ways that just send chills. I'm getting them right now just thinking about it. It's just so lovely and so ethereal sometimes, so strong other times. I mean, it just explores all the different facets of being a boy, his relationship with his parents and his father and his mother. It's funny that when he's enumerating his family, he says, one of the people living with him is his mother, who is good to him. And he takes this very florid, long passage of describing the mother. And then he said, and one is my father, who is good to me. And he gets like 2 bars. So it's pretty clear that this young boy has a much more loving relationship with his mother than with his father. But it's an incredibly beautiful piece. If you haven't heard it, you owe it to yourself to listen to it. Following intermission, that same soprano will join us in singing some Beatles songs. It turns out, and who knew, that in 1968, the Beatles, most especially Lennon, McCartney, and to some degree George Harrison, were into electronic music. In the 60s, this was a very popular thing to do for composers, and they used electronics and electronically produced sounds in all kinds of ways, from pieces that were solely electronic, where they just turned out the lights and turned on the tape, and you sat there listening to these sounds, sometimes wondering how to get out of the theater without killing yourself, and in conjunction with other instruments and other sounds. But the Beatles, of course, if you know their music, were very interested in new things and very experimental. They did not do the same thing over and over and over again. So they were thinking of how to employ this technique and what it meant and how to do it. And at the same time, there was an Italian composer named Luciano Berio who was also using electronic sounds and who appreciated the Beatles and thought that they were an amazing group. The Beatles knew about Berio and liked his music and thought he was pretty good, pretty cool. And they met, apparently, very briefly once in a hallway backstage at some event or other. I'm not sure it was a concert. I think it was a place where Berio made a speech and Paul McCartney was in the audience. And so they met very briefly and spoke, but they never met again. But the Beatles went back and produced a piece called Revolution Number 9, which you might know from the White Album, which is a kind of piece you either love or hate. It's either think it's brilliant or self-indulgent, one or the other, and you're free to think either thing. But it's a lot of electronic sounds and a lot of experimentation in that. Berio went back and he decided he would write an arrangement of some Beatles tunes. So he did. He arranged Michelle and Ticket to Ride and Yesterday and Michelle again, 2 versions of Michelle, and he set them against kind of a Renaissance kind of group of instruments, including a few string players, a couple of wind players, a harpsichord, and the result is charming. And it's a whole different take on these Beatles songs. If you come expecting to hear Ringo Starr-like drumming in the background, you're going to be disappointed because this is more like Bach than it is. But the melodies are intact and the rhythms are intact, but it's the setting that is completely different and presents a whole new take on these Beatles songs. So it's avant-garde rock and roll, people meeting avant-garde classical music composers, and a kind of a mashup that really is quite charming to listen to. Finally on the program, we're going to hear a symphony by Charles Ives. Charles Ives was an American composer. He was famous for not being famous. Nobody liked his music, and his music was seldom performed. He grew up in a musical family. His father was an organist, I think, and a choir director. Ives was a very well-rounded student. He studied music, but he went to Yale, where he studied other things as well as music. He was very active as a student. He was athletically inclined. He played baseball. When he graduated from Yale, he went into the insurance business, and he was extremely successful as an insurance man. Apparently, he was so innovative in his way of organizing and structuring life insurance policies that he kind of was provided the foundation on which modern estate planning is based. So he was very creative, not only in music, but in the insurance business as well, and became a very wealthy man because of that. He never gave up on music, though, and was always composing and writing music. And his approach to music was completely unique to him. He doesn't sound like anybody else. His influences are hard to figure out. He had a totally original approach to things like harmony and rhythm and orchestration and all of the various components of music. Sometimes very hard to understand, sometimes very dense, but always Ivesian. You can always figure out that this is Ives. Now, his third symphony, which is the one we're going to play, he wrote 4 of them, is perhaps the most conservative and the simplest of the 4 symphonies. And it's called the Camp Meeting. When Ives was a young boy, his father would take him to these camp meetings where lots of people would gather in tents, in fields, and express their faith and sing hymns and listen to preachers and so on. Ives' father provided the music for these events oftentimes, and Ives was there listening to all of it, hearing all the hymns, looking at all of the activity, watching the children, and he puts all of this into this symphony. It's in 3 movements. The first movement's called Old Folks Gathering, and it's a very somber, but what marks all of this piece, all of this entire symphony, is his use of Protestant hymns, and there are all kinds of them. Almost every measure has a reference to some hymn or other. So if you think you know the hymn book, you're going to love this piece because you're going to hear bits and pieces of hymns throughout. Oh, 4,000 tongues to sing, just as I am. What a friend we have in Jesus. All of these hymns appear in this symphony. The second movement is called Children's Day, and it's a much livelier piece, as you can imagine, with children running around and playing at marching and soldier and all kinds of things that children would play at. And finally, the last movement is called Communion. I've practiced a particular way of writing, which you might call cumulative writing. He would present themes a little bit at a time, kind of like a mosaic, and you'd hear a bit here, a bit there, and by the end of the movement, all of it would fit together and you would hear the whole theme. And he did that in this piece, in every movement. So not only will you hear these themes, but you will hear just bits and pieces of them, so you'll be challenged to figure out what they are, but the answer kind of always comes. It's a wonderful piece. It's very emotionally accessible. It has a beautiful, beautiful ending that I won't ruin for you. And it's an expression of Ives' music at its very best, I think. The piece was not played until many decades after he wrote it, as was the case with a lot of his music. But since the rediscovery of Charles Ives, his music has gone on to be enjoyed and performed everywhere. Ballet companies love it because it's very interpretable for the dance. And as difficult as it is, orchestras, I think, musicians appreciate it too for his sense of humor, for his ability to express old emotions in new ways. So come, enjoy the concert. We look forward to seeing you there. Bye.
We hope that you enjoyed this week's edition of Know the Score with George Del Gobbo. If you're interested in supporting the CSO or acquiring tickets for our upcoming concerts, please visit csoga.org. That's csoga.org. We thank you for listening.